welcome once again to my webcast, Separating Wheat from the Chaff in Active Directory Domains. This webcast is really all about getting data from Active Directory. Most companies at this point are using AD for their authorization and authentication. And, you know, as pen testers, we typically are brought into an environment to try and gain access to sensitive systems. And Active Directory is still typically the authentication and authorization source for those different resources. So we're constantly trying to gain access to the most elevated accounts so we can then grant ourselves rights to see this personal data or gain access to a specific website or an application, etc. And depending on where you jump into a network, will make a great difference on what you can use to get this information. And while I'll be talking about this as, you know, looking for information as a penetration tester, you can also think about this if you're an administrator of how information is placed in Active Directory and how things happen, that you might be able to audit and go through and find what you're looking for to try and correct anything that has weakened the security posture of your domain and forest. So before I get started in detail, my name is Eric Kuehn. I'm a security consultant with Secure Ideas, and I've been with the company for about 5.5 months now. Before I started with Secure Ideas, I was responsible for the Active Directory infrastructure of a small little financial institution called Bank of America. That Active Directory domain and forest, that entire infrastructure was rather large and complex and required us to stay on top of it to make sure that the environment was as secure and as healthy as we possibly could. Before that point, I worked for an entertainment company based out of Orlando called Walt Disney World, and that's really where I got started with Active Directory. So when we moved from Exchange 5.5 over to Exchange 2000 and we went from Windows NT to Active Directory, I was lucky enough to be on that project to really get started. So for the last 17 plus years, I've really been focused on Active Directory. When I'm not working, I'm a movie enthusiast. I love going to see movies, whether that's at home or in the theater. I used to be an avid gamer, both of online games, but also board games, etc. But over the last 13 years, my wife and I, we've managed to bring in 4 children to this world. And since that point, really all of my hobbies have kind of taken a back seat as I shuttle them back and forth to their different activities. Very fulfilling, but someday I'll be able to start having my hobbies again. For those of you who aren't familiar, Secure Ideas is a security consulting firm based out of Jacksonville, Florida, started by Kevin Johnson. We offer a variety of different services to different companies and groups. And one of those is education and training, which is why we're here today. We really want to have everybody be better informed about security so that it's harder for issues to come up, for, to make the overall security posture of different companies stronger so that maybe at some point we won't necessarily be needed. Everything will be secure and we won't have to worry about data breaches. So some quick basics about Active Directory, just in case you're unfamiliar with it. It is a LDAP directory. It's based on LDAP with of course, a couple little custom features here and there for Microsoft because that's what they do with all of their tools. There are 2 main portions and partitions to Active Directory, both of which are separate LDAP directories. There's the domain partition and the forest partition. Domain is what we're typically interested in. A domain is a security boundary of devices and users and objects that is really that has a certain group that has the ability to be administrators of that environment. A forest is a collection of domains that have a common set of attributes and object types within them. So the domain partition has all of the details about objects within that domain, whether that's their password or their logon information, any number of bits of information, names, etc., group membership, everything. The global catalog partition has a subset of that information pertaining to all of the objects within the forest. This webcast and presentation is really focused on the domain-specific portion. You can search the global catalog if you want, but once again, it doesn't give all the information. So we're talking about just normal LDAP. Within a domain, objects are stored within OUs. OUs are a way of separating different objects based upon business need or security configurations, who has the ability to make changes to those objects, or forcing policy down to computers and users within those OUs. Within those OUs, as I said, it's set up to do different security and force policy. That OU has a very specific naming construct, and that's actually how, when you're handling LDAP interactions, what you're actually trying to bind to is that LDAP name. And my GoToMeeting is not formatted properly, so I can't see if you have a question. Give me 1 second. All right. Sorry about that. So the distinguished name contains both the object name that you actually want to find and then the OU and then the domain name. It's all very specific, and that's actually what you're binding to when you're looking for information for a specific object. You may not see it because you've done a search in the background, but that's what's happening. And that naming convention always follows the same standard. It's CN equals and the name of the object you want, OU equals, and then the entire path of the OUs up. For each different OU that you are nested within, it's another OU equals. And then DC is the DNS portion of the domain name. So for example, my test domain will be dev.pvt. So I would need a DC equals dev and a DC equals pvt. That's all rather complex, and very rarely will we actually look for an object in that manner, but it's good to know because sometimes you may have to. Typically, we're going to do searches on names that we're familiar with, like SAM account name, which is what everybody knows as the login ID, or the name or CN, the friendly name. So for example, I might have a login ID of S153628, and that pertains to my name, Eric Kuehn. On top of being a LDAP directory, Active Directory is also, and domain controllers are also file servers. They have 2 shares that are available to everybody in the domain. The net logon share, which has the legacy logon scripts held over away from NT4 actually, but still can be used at this point in time, and sysvol, which contains all of the group policy objects, which are configuration settings that are pushed down to devices. So attacking AD. As I said, this is really focused on gathering information because Active Directory by default is rather secure. Domain controllers are secure. It takes some custom configurations to make them less secure, putting on extra services or extra applications. Active Directory is actually secure to the point that you need an ID to interact with it, right? You can't just start interacting anonymously with AD. There is one level that you can get, but it gives very little information. So typically what's happening is we gain access, administrative access to Active Directory by compromising other systems or IDs. And as I said before, we're looking for AD administrative access because while domain admins and enterprise admins, the highest level of administrative groups and IDs there are in the forest, don't have rights to everything on a server, they can grant themselves rights to those objects or those resources. So really, once again, we're looking to get information to help us figure out what IDs, what groups exist in Active Directory to see where we might need to go to get those admin IDs, or IDs that we can use to grant ourselves rights. So what's the general strategy? Find the domain in the forest that a device belongs to, get an ID within that domain, see what that ID has rights to, get information about that ID, the groups that it's a part of, see what groups, or get other key groups that exist in the domain, get the members of those groups, see if we might be there already, and then see what other members are parts of those groups. So really it's kind of a circle of find one, then going through and seeing what is it a member of, seeing who else is a member of the same group, trying to figure out a path, once again, to get to that final ID. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, I believe the slides, they will be made available to everyone in the future. We'll have a quick record of who attended and send them out, but they are not ready as of right now. So interesting data. What data do we want to find within Active Directory? So once again, I covered, we want to find out who has admin rights to AD already. And there's 3 core groups that have that. There's domain admins, enterprise admins, and built-in admins. Domain admin sounds exactly like it is. It's someone who has admin rights to everything within that specific domain. Enterprise admins are domain admins in pretty much every domain within a forest. And then the built-in administrators is actually created because of how a domain is created from a Windows server in the very beginning. It's held over, but pretty much if you are a domain admin or an enterprise admin, you are part of the built-in administrators group, which means that you can take ownership of objects within Active Directory, modify them, make yourself an administrator, etc. But that's just one level. What else do we want to find? Well, maybe we want to know what the general password policy for the domain is. Why is this helpful? Well, if we see that the general domain policy is a password only needs to be 6 characters in length and not complex, we know we'll probably be able to crack those offline within minutes. If they're 15 characters long, well, that makes, you know, trying to break password hashes a little bit less something we're not going to spend as much focus on because it will take too long. It also will tell us things like how many times we could try and just log in with an ID before we lock it out and how long that ID will stay locked out. There's other groups out there that are just as interesting as domain admins and administrative groups, things like server operators. These aren't used very often, but if somebody is a member of that group, they have the ability to make changes to domain controllers. And if you can make a change to a domain controller, you can start manipulating AD. Account operators. By default, account operators have the ability to modify all users, groups, and computers within a domain. That all is slightly modified. They won't be able to modify anything that gives them admin access to Active Directory. They won't be able to modify those top 3 groups, but everything else is pretty much fair game. And then there's backup operators. If you're a member of that group, you'll be able to take backups of domain controllers and do whatever you wish to, take them offline and start attacking them, getting their passwords, etc. As I said, typically these aren't used by enterprises because of the huge number of permissions it gives, but they're still there, and I have seen them in use in some companies. Another thing that you may not think of right off the bat is what networks and subnets are used by this enterprise. When we come into a network, sometimes all we're given is a port, right? We come in, we're not given any information about this enterprise, what networks they have, what devices are there, anything. Once we can get access to AD, we can go through and see what subnets have been defined with an Active Directory to allow it to be efficient when handling client requests. And all of those networks are things that we can then scan to see what else is out there on the environment. Delegated administration. This is really how Microsoft expects things to happen. They don't want, the company doesn't want everyone to be doing work under domain administrative privileges. It's a recognized threat and method of making your environment less secure. So the expectation is the ability to modify objects has been delegated to other IDs out there. So once again, if all we're looking for is the ability to grant ourselves access to different services and different applications, we may not need to get domain admin rights. We just need to know who has the ability to modify these groups. And that's something we can find. Here's another interesting one. Who owns what computer? Yet again, it seems like maybe it's not that helpful, but it really is. There are lots of tools out there that will help you find where people are logged on right now, but that traffic could be picked up by certain network devices and other things, and be flagged by security groups. If all we're doing is looking at information in Active Directory, we might be able to see who owns that computer and get an idea of where people are going to log on without doing any of these other activities. It's happened just recently, whether it's by what the computer is named. So for example, if my ID is S127 and there's a computer called S127-C, there's a pretty good chance that that's my computer. Or there's other attributes that could be there that say this user ID actually owns this computer. When I said earlier that Active Directory is remarkably secure, there are some methods that you could have passwords in clear text. And actually, I'll be covering those later. But there's a possibility that somebody could have put passwords out there within the directory that you can read without any special tools and get more IDs and passwords. And then finally, the last one I have on here, because it's something that we've run into recently, is identify IDs that you can't use NTLM authentication with. AD has two types of authentication, NTLM, which is older and less secure, and Kerberos. With NTLM, without ever breaking or cracking the password that's actually used in that NTLM hash, we have the ability to do what's called pass the hash attacks, which is we literally just take that encrypted blob, move it forward, and use it without ever knowing the password. There is a way with, since Active Directory 2012 R2 and on, where you can make IDs that can't use NTLM authentication at all, and therefore you cannot do pass the hash attacks with these IDs. So we've gone through the different things that maybe we want to look for. How do we actually get there? And once again, depending on how you start your process with a client or what you're trying to find and what device you have to do the queries from, makes a huge difference of what options you have available. And really, I break this down into 5 core groups. Maybe some people will say 3, but I think of them as 5 different ways because of how they work. The first is net commands. These are old command line utilities way from Windows NT that have carried through until now. They can give a whole bunch of information, but not necessarily useful when trying to programmatically use that data in other methods. Then there's LDAP tools. This is my category of tools and utilities, typically manual, but not necessarily, that come with different clients that allow you to manually interact with AD from an LDAP perspective. PowerShell is Microsoft's new scripting language. It's been around for almost 15 years now, but really it's their main focus. And since 2008 R2 and on, it's been included with every Windows device. So that is another option if you're on a Windows box. Then there's the DS commands. This is yet another command line utility. It's more flexible than net commands, but it has some more requirements before you can use it. But it's been available since 2008 and on. And then there's PowerShell with AD Cmdlets. I know this is similar to PowerShell, but it actually has a whole bunch of flexibility and does a lot of translation behind the scenes. So digging into each of these a little bit more, the net commands, as I said, they've been around since NT. They give data, but it's really a minimal amount. And the formatting makes it hard to use those by default. It might be the only option you have. You know, if you've managed to land on a Windows 2000 box, right, and that's what you started trying to search AD from, this is pretty much all you have. It's better than nothing, but maybe there are other tools you'd rather use. So there are things like net accounts, which will give you the password policy for a domain. Net user will tell you information about a user account. Net group, members of that group. Net local group is if you want to interact with the groups on the server itself and not within the domain. And then who am I groups. While this isn't necessarily a net command, it's useful to see what your ID that you're currently logged on with is a member of to begin with. LDAP tools. As I said, I see these mainly as manual tools, things like LDP, which is a Microsoft product. Active Directory users and computers, or Apache Directory Studio. These are OS agnostic, and maybe they're installed on a device or not. Typically, when we go to a client, we have our own laptops. We may not have a Windows device, but we have our own, whether it's a Linux instance or a Mac instance, whatever it might be. There are LDAP tools that you can load and start interacting with AD. If you're going to do searches, it's good to know some LDAP basics. And then also the other problem with these tools, other than them being manual and being more time constrained, is that it requires a translation of some of the values, things like date-time values. Microsoft doesn't store anything in AD as an actual date-time value. It's 100 nanosecond intervals since 1601. Not sure why they picked it exactly, but that is what they've done. And it requires you to go through and translate those into something that's readable. LDP does this by default. Other tools may not. So if you're going to do a search with one of these LDAP tools, you want to make it as specific as possible. And the reason is two reasons. There's two main reasons. The first is that it makes it faster. It makes it return, your query get returned quicker. LDAP is a database, and therefore there are indexed entries and non-indexed entries. Using an indexed entry makes it come back quick. It also makes sure that you don't get flagged by the domain controller itself. If you use something that's considered expensive or unoptimized, the domain controller will actually log an event that an administrator might see and start to look at. So when you're searching for something by name, a computer, you always want to use CN and the computer name. A group is also CN and computer name. And once again, a user, or when you have a login ID, is SAM account name. Some other good filters, if you want to do something, you'll see most LDAP directories have the object class attribute. And this is multi-value, and it contains everything that that object could be. A good example of this is a computer object and a user object are both considered users. And so if you say object class equals user, you'll get both. If you use object category, something that Microsoft put in, you'll only get that specific object. So object category user will only give you user IDs. Object category group will only give you groups. PowerShell. Since PowerShell 2, which was released with Server 2008 R2, there has been the ability to interact with AD. It's all done through .NET libraries, though. It's not exactly the most intuitive method of getting information, but once again, it might be the only thing you have. Recently, I was on an engagement where we had to get information about a PCI network, and we landed on a device, and for some reason they had blocked everything except some PowerShell. And so once again, the only way I could start moving forward to see who owned this device and see where we might be able to go was to start building using the System Directory Services .NET library. This takes knowledge of both AD and .NET libraries. So not necessarily where to start, and I have some examples that we can go through, but you'll see that it takes a little bit more effort to get there. Sometimes, like I said, it's the only thing we have. This would not be the first pick if you have other devices out there, but still worth mentioning. The DS commands. Another command line utility. Like I said, it's built in to Windows Server 2008. If the Active Directory Services tools are installed on that device. In many organizations that I've seen over the last several months, as well as ones that I worked at, these were installed on servers. It doesn't mean it's a domain controller, but it gives the ability to have those tools, such as Active Directory users, computers, sites and services, etc., available on the server. So typically I do see this as something to use if I've managed to start my searching from a server and not a workstation. The benefit to these tools over the net commands is it's more flexible. You can see more object types, you can get more information from those objects, you can parse it a little bit better. It still won't show all the information, but it still has more than the net commands. And really, there's two different parts to it. There's the DS query and DS get. DS query does what it sounds like. It queries for different objects out in Active Directory. It searches for them. It won't give you information about them other than it says, I found one. So what happens is you take the information from DS query and you move it into DS get, and that will allow you to see the information that you're actually looking for. When you're doing searches for objects using DS query, it can be filtered to different object types: group, user, etc. And really, there's three different methods of filtering the objects. The name, which is the common name for a group. The SAM ID, which is the SAM account name or the login ID, or a description. I do not recommend doing searches by description because it is not necessarily very fast, and once again could potentially get you flagged on a domain controller. But it is available if you want to do it. Finally, we come to the most recent addition to this, which is the PowerShell AD Cmdlets. This is similar to the DS tools in that it requires extra features to be installed on the device. I do not see these installed typically on workstations, and I don't see them installed on most servers. So while these tools give you the most information and the most flexibility and the best way of getting data formatted how you want, they're also the least common unless you have them installed on your device already. These tools don't require you to be a member of the domain. Unlike the .NET or the net commands, the DS commands, these can be run remotely. All you need is an ID. They don't necessarily work 100% of the time that way, but they do work almost all of the time. The downside to these are that if you're doing it from a client device, something owned by the enterprise, all of your activity could be logged locally. Whether or not that's a problem is really unsure, right? You can't say it will be or it will not be, but there is PowerShell auditing, and each one of these commands will be logged and kept on that device. And I threw out a handful of suggestions of good ones to know. The default domain password policy is exactly what it sounds like. That information, the same information you get from net accounts. AD group member allows you to see who is a member of a group or any nested group. AD user gives you user objects. User result and password policy. This is one that isn't available through other tools. Since it was available with 2008 R2, but not really as well introduced until Server 2012, there's the ability to do fine-grained password policies, which says we have a default domain policy out there that says X, Y, and Z. But for these different objects, or these different users, we want to have a better policy, right? More restrictive. This command will let you see if they have membership into one of these policies. If you're an administrator, unfortunately, you have to be a domain admin. You can actually see the settings, but without it, you can see if they are a member, at least. Then you have get AD computer, which gives you computer objects, and then get GPO report, which allows you to see what policies are being pushed down via a GPO to different devices. So let's go through a couple of examples of when we might want to use one. And this is dependent on, once again, what type of device you are using, and then also what is available, and sometimes the best way of getting the information, because each one of these is not the same. So the first one here is, how do we know what Active Directory we actually want to use or we want to target? If you're on a Windows device, you have three options. If they have the cmdlets, the AD cmdlets, you can say get AD domain. Once again, probably not going to happen very often. You can also do get WMI object with PowerShell, which will get you information about the server, including what domain it's a member of, or you can use system info, which gives you more information than just the domain. But hey, we'll run through each one. System info is probably the typical one that everybody will use. And as you see, we're right here. This is probably not information to a lot of people, but the next one may be. Oh, sorry, I was going to show the PowerShell as well. Oops. Let me bring that back. Please come back. And there, once again, there's the domain. So this is helpful, but once again, it's if you're on a Windows device. What happens if you have your own device that you're there, right? You've brought in your own laptop, or you are on a Linux device that isn't a member of the domain. At that point, you can use DNS itself, and those are the SRV records. Let me bring this back. So if you search for SRV records, you can actually say, show me all of the domain controllers that are a member of this forest. And that will list, once again, all the global catalogs, which could be DCs from multiple domains. You can then go down and say, show me all of the domain controllers from this specific domain to give you a complete list. And all you need to know for that one is what your network name is, which is nice. There are times where companies will use a disjointed namespace, so it won't match, and this won't work either. But in that case, you're typically lucky in the fact that there'll be more NTLM around and not just Kerberos, because Kerberos names requires a very specific, it requires that your DNS name match what you're trying to find. So if I bring up my device, this is not a member of the domain that I have here. This is showing local, but workstation, we'll see that I'm just the local. It's not part of the domain. But if we look at the IP configuration, we'll say, hey, this is what's being pushed by DHCP, this dev.pvt domain. Let's see if it itself is the domain by just by using NSLOOKUP. You have to tell it that you want to look at SRV records first. Otherwise, it won't return anything. But once again, if we just say, hey, what is here? I only have one domain controller in this small environment, but here it is, and here's its IP address. If there were multiple domains, let's say we had dev.pvt and child.pvt and child2, they'd all be listed here with different domain controllers. So maybe I want to find the DCs, all of the DCs for those domains. I would go through each one. Now, what this has done is, once again, we've landed on a device. We don't have necessarily any other information, but now we have picked out where the domain controllers are, and this might give us more information about networks even before we have an ID. So we know the domains, we know the domain controllers, and yet again, we haven't actually landed on a device that interacts with AD directly. So finding password policies. This is my example of why you might want to use one tool over another, even if you're on a Windows box. So there's the manual process, which requires you to just have, let's say, Apache Studio. So once again, we'll say at this point, we've managed to get an ID. It doesn't make a difference if it's a computer account or it's a user account or it has any administrative rights or not. It is just an account. Oh, wonderful. There's my mouse. So we want to make an LDAP connection manually. All it requires is the server. You don't even need the name. You could just use the IP address and authentication. So in this case, I have dev test user. He doesn't have any rights to anything, but he's still an ID. You connect, and you can see different bits of information. These are the different partitions available with LDAP. And this one here that matches that name I told you before, that distinguished name for the domain, is the one we're interested in. And you can see that it gives us things like lockout duration, lockout observation window, password age, minimum password age. So all of these are just numbers that we have to translate. For things that come in days, like lockout duration, or these are minutes, sorry, lockout duration, the observation window, you have to divide by 600 million. And that gives you a translatable age. Anything that's actual dates requires even more translation. Luckily, Windows has something built in that will let you do that without having to load special code. And that's through Windows Time. So if I grab, oh, sorry, those are dates. These are all by the 100 million. So if you're trying to get days, it comes out to like 864 billion is what you have to divide it by. But it will be translated into something that you actually see as minutes or days or hours. So LDAP, once again, gives you information, but unfortunately not necessarily usable right off the bat. If you have the member of, if you're on a device that's a member of the domain, you could simply use net accounts. And this tells you what the device sees, not necessarily what the policy is in Active Directory. They should match, but if they're having a problem, if the workstation is having a problem, this is what it was set to at some point. Once again, it should match, but it may not. But this is definitely easier than net accounts. They're much easier than looking at the root and doing the manual translation. The DS query will give you the same information as net accounts, but also requires some filtering. So it's also not as useful as net accounts. If we go to straight PowerShell, you're looking at about 31 lines of code. And that allows you to do the translation as well as see the information. I'm not going to type this out because it'll take a little bit too much time. But as you see, it will tell you things like if it's complex, et cetera, and it does all the translation for you instead of leaving it as values you can't use. Then you have, which is probably the best since you can see the resultant policy and custom password policies, you have the AD tools. Oops. So as we saw from net accounts, it is the same. If we do the so I'm not running this as an administrator, so it gave me an error, which is what you'll see with anything other than an administrator. So I said, hey, does this account have a custom password policy? And even though it's an error, we do see that it is a member of that policy. It does have a policy called elevated password policy. if we're an administrator, we can actually see what it is. But unless you're lucky, and I have yet to be that lucky when working on engagements, and you get a domain admin right off the bat, you kind of have to guess what those policies are, but you can bet that they're more restrictive. And if we look at the difference, all this one says is, hey, the minimum password length for these IDs is 10 instead of 7. Members of interesting groups. This moves about the same way. So if we want to do the manual method, it requires a search. The net group is useful in some ways. Let's see if it'll come up. And I have so many different devices because when we get to some of the other tools, I'm hoping to have a demo here that shows finding this information. So if we use this, we see the output is, here are the members of domain admins, the group, and we get 3. There might be groups in here, but we don't know that. We just know that these IDs have that ability. The interesting thing about this tool is it doesn't understand the administrators group. It can't comprehend why there's an administrators group in the domain. So for that, you can use DS query. And as I said before, if you do a search, it just tells you that that group exists if you use DS query. The pipe, similar to Unix commands and PowerShell, is just move this forward. So I'm saying, actually get me the group and show me members. And if we look, there's actually a group in there as well. But if we want to give us the same information as before, if you say expand, it actually shows the groups and all the users that are in there nested or otherwise. So once again, the net command gave us some information. This is a little bit better in that it gives us the actual users. We could then move this forward into DS user or DS get user and get more information if we wanted about those individual users, but we're just leaving it here for right now. And then there's AD group member. Which gives us even more information. If you're not familiar with PowerShell, well, if you are familiar with PowerShell, you could take this and you can actually move it through, once again, other commands to get more information about those user objects. So I'm actually going to filter this a little bit so we can just see some information a little bit less. So if I do the AD group member and just show the name of these objects, we see, hey, there's an administrator, domain admin, and loop domain admins. Similar to ds-get, we can tell it to do this recursive. And now it's dropped any group and it just gives us the user IDs. We can take this and then move it on to other things as, you know, once again, let's find all the members of these, or all the groups that these IDs are members of. The other benefit to the PowerShell one is if you are a member of the domain and you run this, it will go through and it will get referrals to objects in other domains, not just ones that are local. So I only have a single domain forest, so can't show that functionality, but this is useful in that perhaps somebody has nested a group that points to a child domain, and now suddenly they have administrative rights even though you did not know that. Finding networks, because of time, I'm actually not going to do this, but it shows you, once again, multiple ways to get this same information. I use this one quite often to try and compare with what clients have told us to make sure we're actually looking at the entire network and making sure we get every device out there to make sure we know what is available for us to scan, potentially compromise, and move forward with. And then finding GPO information. As you can tell, using AD PowerShell itself is still not necessarily the cleanest method. But what is happening to devices is very important. Following best practices, things like preventing your domain admins from being able to log on to devices except domain controllers is pushed through group policy. What the auditing policy is for the domain is pushed through group policy. And it's useful to see that information. So let me bring up a domain controller here. And I'm just going to paste that because it's very long to write. And all I've actually asked it to do is I said, find all the OUs in the domain. Find all the group policy objects that exist linked to those OUs. And I only want to know if it has a group policy object. Then we say, show me the properties for that, go through each one of them, and find the group policy object. And this formatted horribly, but then actually build a report. So with that one long line, I've gone through and I've told it to enumerate all of the different GPOs out there and let us see them. And so here are the 3 different group policy objects out there in my domain. And we can see the default domain controllers policy. And we could see what is set, what's being audited, what is being pushed down through this one. In this case, it's the DC policy. So we have the audit directory, what auditing is happening, who's allowed to log into domain controllers. And as we see, by default, it's administrators. And then what we're going to do now is actually we're going to exploit this setting right here. We're actually going to do an official attack against AD. I used, air quotes there. By default, this is a setting that I've seen enabled in more companies than I expected. This setting here, add workstations to the domain, says that anybody has the ability, if they are a valid user, can join a computer to the domain. That may not necessarily seem like a bad thing, but it is. Because when you join a computer to the domain, by default, it's put in a special location called the computers container. And that container has only the smallest number of policies assigned to it, the ones that affect all of the devices. This is mainly your password policy. In addition, it lets me put a device in the domain that I can control who's an administrator to, who, whether or not Kerberos can be used on it or only NTLM, et cetera. So that's what we're going to do right now. It's very easy. We see, because we were able to get that policy or that information, that it's available. And if I can find my VM. Here he is. So we have the ID that we managed to get, whether that's through cracking a password or being given that ID, whatever it might be. And I'm just going to go through and I'm going to say, hey, let's make him part of the domain. And I'm going to specify that account that I have, and I will show you while this is rebooting that it is not an administrator. But hey, it said, yep, welcome to the domain. Now, if you're actually doing this yourself, before you reboot, you want to make a couple small changes here before you aren't able to log into your own device as an administrator. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, hey, I want to make my test user account. As we wait. As always with demos, things never go perfect. Thank you. Here we go. So I made myself an administrator, and I'm going to remove others from being an administrator. So while that is going, so all I did is I said, show me all the information about this user account. We're only really interested in a couple of things, but here's the member of, which is all the groups that this is an ID is a member of. And we see he's part of nothing. So this is a user account that had no rights to anything. It has no admin rights. But once again, because of this setting, add workstations to the domain, I was able to do so. So at this point, we have a device that we control that we're an administrator on. Let it think and say, give its little spiel, but it has none of the corporate or enterprise-wide controls on it. There's no AV, there's no bit9 if you use bit9, nothing there to stop us from running whatever we want. This is very important for the next series of things that we want to do, because once again, there's these built-in tools that we have, which we've gone through, DS commands, net commands, PowerShell, etc. And here's the steps that we did. Oh, we'll remove SPNs in a minute. But we want to have our own device join there so we can use some other things, such as PowerSploit. These are my favorite tools for getting information out of AD, right? PowerView is probably the #1 tool that I have. It will do a slew of things similar to what we got with other device, with the other commands, finding users, groups, etc. But it also does things like find those clear text passwords I was telling you about. And I realize we're running out of time, so I will go as quickly as I can and show. Here we go. And as administrator, turn off our AV. I don't know why he's prompting me to run. Oh my goodness. Well, it has two options in there, and for some reason I am getting prompted by my device, which I have not in the past. We'll see if I manage to load it. No. It comes with two things called get PP password and GPP auto login. These will read the clear text out of there. It will read the clear text passwords stored within GPOs and let you see them. Unfortunately, PowerSploit's not willing to load on my device, even though it should at this moment. The other tool that I wanted to show is something called Bloodhound. This is yet another tool that is definitely worth having on your own device. It basically gives you the ability to see the visual relationships between objects and their permissions and things that are out there. The downside are it requires multiple components, a database, PowerShell, a front end, etc. But if you have them on your own device, you can use them. The other small downside to it is in order to make it be a little less obvious to some network devices, and as well to be very thorough in the information that it gets, it takes a while to gather all the information. Even in my small domain, which has practically nothing in it, it took 10 minutes to run. If you make that for a much larger enterprise, it could take a considerable amount of time, but it's definitely worth it once you get everything loaded. And we have a default database, so I'm going to load this very fast so you can see it. I'm running out of time, so I'm getting a little flustered. I apologize. Going to log into the ID that definitely has rights. Come on. And once again, Bloodhound, after it loads, this is the default information. As you can see, by default, it shows you the different groups that it thinks are important and people who are members. It gives you a slew of information, all very visual. The biggest one are, let's say we had an ID that we just got, and we wanted to see how to get domain admins. It will actually go through and find the path for you to take to get there. So it says that this ID is actually an administrator on this box that is also an administrator, and it will take you through the path to get to the different devices you should go through to get to your final place, which would be domain admins at external.local. So overall, this is a great tool. As I said, it can be a little slow at times depending on the number of devices, but definitely worth investigating. It's out there on GitHub, made by some very intelligent people, and definitely worth looking at. I know we're 2 minutes over. I appreciate everybody waiting to show that last little bit. I will get the slides out to everybody, and we went through a slew of information, and I'll be more willing to answer any questions if people would like to stay online a little bit longer. If not, thank you very much for attending. Bloodhound is definitely one of the tools that
Unmuted.
I recommend using. As I said, the big problem with it is whether or not you have the time to get the data, and if you have the processing power to run it. It is definitely a great tool worth using, but typically I can find the data myself going through the information in AD, but it is definitely a tool worth investigating. What typically happens is once I have an ID and I can start enumerating information, I'll start Bloodhound, and if it finishes within a reasonable amount of time, I will use it. And really how long it takes is really dependent on how big the environment is, because it's doing a lot more than just reading information from AD. It's actually reading information from AD, trying to go see where active sessions are at that moment. So it is doing a tremendous amount of information gathering. You can get similar information from, searching Active Directory and then using tools from PowerView, such as Find Local Admin Access or User Hunter, two other great tools. Thank you. All right. Yes, I will be sending out the slides to folks, or we will post that it is available to get. I'll be sure to see when Kevin is moving to different groups. I believe he's, I don't remember exactly where he is right now. He's always around. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody attending. Thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a great day.